Every morning at 7:12 a.m., he raised the same flag he once saluted in combat. Then one afternoon, a black SUV pulled into his driveway, and a woman stepped out to tell him he wasn't allowed to fly it anymore. That was the moment everything changed. Every morning at exactly 7:12 a.m., before most of the neighborhood had even opened their blinds, Daniel Harper rolled himself down the smooth concrete ramp attached to the front of his house. The ramp had been approved by the HOA after months of paperwork, inspections, and what felt like subtle resistance, but that was another story. What mattered to him was what stood at the edge of his small, perfectly trimmed lawn, a 6-foot silver flagpole anchored in concrete, with a clean, crisp American flag folded neatly at its base. Daniel moved slowly, not because he lacked discipline, but because his body demanded patience. The prosthetic leg attached just above his knee clicked faintly against the pavement as he shifted his weight. The early morning air was cool, and the neighborhood was silent except for birds and the distant hum of sprinklers. He liked that silence. It reminded him of dawn overseas, when the world paused for just a moment before chaos resumed. With steady hands, he clipped the flag to the pole. There was nothing flashy about it. Standard size, standard design, no added slogans, no political message, just red, white, and blue fabric that caught the morning light. He raised it carefully. To Daniel, this wasn't a political statement. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't decoration. It was ritual. Some people drank coffee. Some scrolled their phones. Daniel raised the flag. For 32 years of his life, he had served under that symbol. 2 tours overseas. 1 roadside explosion that changed everything. The doctor said he was lucky to be alive. He wasn't sure. Lucky was the word he would use. But he came home breathing. And for him, that was enough. When he bought the house in the quiet suburban development called Maple Ridge Estates, he wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for peace. A small yard, a driveway wide enough for his modified truck, a neighborhood that felt safe. Maple Ridge Estates advertised itself as proudly patriotic. There were flags at the entrance during the 4th of July. Red, white, and blue wreaths in December. A giant banner that reads "Support our troops every Memorial Day." So when Daniel installed a single flagpole in his own yard, he assumed it wouldn't be a problem. For 3 weeks, it wasn't. A few neighbors nodded at him in quiet approval. One older man across the street even gave him a thumbs up one morning. Kids rode their bikes past his house without a second glance. Life continued. Until the afternoon the black SUV pulled into his driveway. Daniel had just finished adjusting the pole rope when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned his wheelchair slightly and saw her step out. Sharp sunglasses, clipboard tucked under one arm, perfectly styled hair that didn't move in the breeze. Cynthia Blake, vice president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She walked up his driveway like she was approaching a code violation. "Mr. Harper," she called out, her voice tight and rehearsed. "That's me," he replied calmly. She glanced at the flag above him before even making eye contact. "I've received several complaints regarding your property." Daniel followed her gaze upward. The flag fluttered gently in the wind. "Complaints?" he asked. "Yes," she said, flipping open her clipboard. "Your flag installation was not approved by the Architectural Review Committee." He blinked once, processing the words. "It's a flagpole," he said evenly. "Standard height. Installed professionally." "That may be," she replied. Her tone clipped. "But Maple Ridge has very specific aesthetic standards. Permanent flagpoles require prior written approval." Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "It's the American flag," he said quietly. Cynthia adjusted her sunglasses. "And this is a private community." The silence between them felt heavier than it should have. Daniel had faced explosions, gunfire, loss. He had learned to measure people quickly. Cynthia wasn't shouting. She wasn't emotional. That almost made it worse. Her calm felt procedural, detached, like she was discussing lawn fertilizer instead of something sacred. "I didn't realize I needed permission to fly the American flag," Daniel said. "You do," she responded. when it involves structural modification to your front yard. She handed him a folded sheet of paper. Consider this a formal notice. You have 7 days to remove the pole or face a $200 noncompliance fine. The number hung in the air. $200. For a flag. Daniel looked down at the paper in his hands. Official HOA letterhead. Violation code 14B. Unapproved exterior installation. He looked back up at her. Who complained? He asked. Cynthia paused for just half a second. That information is confidential. Of course it was. She turned to leave, heels clicking sharply against the driveway. Before stepping into her SUV, she added one more sentence over her shoulder. This isn't a military base. Mr. Harper, we have community standards to uphold. Then she drove away. Daniel remained in his driveway long after the vehicle disappeared. The flag above him continued to wave, unaware of the conflict it had apparently caused. That night, he reread the HOA bylaws, line by line. Buried in dense language about fencing materials and mailbox colors was a clause about temporary holiday displays. It mentioned flags could be displayed for national holidays. It said nothing clearly about permanent poles, just vague wording about architectural harmony. Vague enough to enforce, vague enough to interpret. The next morning at 7:12 a.m., Daniel rolled back outside. He attached the flag again, raised it again, higher than the day before. By noon, the whispers had started. A neighbor 2 houses down avoided eye contact. Another stood at her window longer than usual. A man walking his dog slowed just enough to glance at the pole and then at Daniel. By the third day, a second envelope appeared in his mailbox. Final notice. $200 fine applied to his account. Failure to comply may result in further action. Daniel stared at the words for a long time. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the threat. It was the message. Somewhere in a neighborhood that advertised patriotism at its entrance sign, a disabled veteran was being fined for flying the very flag they printed on their seasonal banners. And what hurt the most wasn't the confrontation. It was the quiet, the silence from neighbors, the closed blinds, the absence of anyone saying, "This isn't right." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft orange light, Daniel wheeled himself back outside to lower the flag for the night. He folded it with the same care he had used for decades. Precise, respectful, intentional. As he held the folded fabric in his lap, he looked down the quiet street of Maple Ridge Estates. They thought this was about landscaping rules. They thought this was about aesthetics. They thought it was just a flagpole. They had no idea what they had just started. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 6:30 p.m. in the Maple Ridge Community Clubhouse, a beige building that looked more like a bank than a place for neighbors to gather. Daniel arrived early. He always did. Old habits from military briefings never left him. If there was going to be a confrontation, he preferred to face it head-on. He rolled through the wide double doors, the soft hum of his wheelchair echoing faintly against the polished tile floor. The room smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant. Folding chairs were lined up in neat rows, and at the front sat a long table where the board members would preside. A small American flag stood in the corner of the room near the podium. Daniel noticed that immediately. Interesting, he thought. Neighbors trickled in, some offering tight smiles, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Whispers floated in the air, soft but sharp enough to feel. That's him. The flag guy. I heard he refused to take it down. HOA rules are HOA rules. Daniel parked near the aisle, hands resting calmly in his lap. His posture was straight, composed. On the outside, he looked steady. On the inside, something heavier was settling in his chest, not anger yet, but disappointment. At exactly 6:30 p.m., Cynthia Blake entered from a side door with 2 other board members behind her. She carried her usual clipboard, though tonight it was thicker, stuffed with printed documents. She took her seat at the center of the table like a judge about to open court. "Let us bring this meeting to order," she said, tapping a pen against the microphone. Routine matters came first. Landscaping violations, parking complaints, someone's trash bin left out overnight. Daniel listened quietly, waiting. Then Cynthia cleared her throat. Next item on the agenda. Property violation 14B. Unapproved exterior installation at 214 Maple Ridge Drive. Every head in the room turned toward him. Cynthia didn't look at him immediately. She shuffled papers, drawing out the moment. Mr. Daniel Harper installed a permanent flagpole without prior architectural review committee approval. She said, he has been notified and fined accordingly, but has refused compliance. Refused compliance. The words felt deliberate. Daniel raised his hand slightly. May I speak? Cynthia nodded with a tight smile. You'll have 3 minutes. He rolled forward slowly, positioning himself so everyone could see him clearly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. I installed a 6-foot flagpole in my front yard. He began. It flies a standard United States flag. No banners. No advertisements. No political messages. He paused, letting the room absorb that. I served this country for 32 years. I lost my leg serving this country. I didn't realize I needed written permission to display its flag at my own home. A murmur rippled through the audience. Cynthia leaned toward her microphone. This isn't about patriotism, Mr. Harper. This is about maintaining community standards. Permanent structures require approval. That rule applies to everyone. Daniel looked at her steadily. Is there a rule against flying the American flag? There is a rule against unapproved installations. So if I had asked first, he said calmly, would it have been approved? Cynthia hesitated just long enough for people to notice. That would have depended on placement. Dimensions. Visual impact. Visual impact. Daniel repeated softly. One of the other board members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Cynthia's voice sharpened slightly. This is not a military base. Maple Ridge is a private residential community. We have aesthetic standards to uphold. The room went still. The sentence hung there, heavier than she seemed to realize. Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had been calm before. Patient. But that phrase, this is not a military base, cut deeper than she intended. No, he replied evenly. It's not a military base. That's why I came here. For peace. A few neighbors lowered their eyes. Cynthia pressed on. The board is not targeting you. We are enforcing uniform guidelines. If we allow one unapproved structure, we open the door to others. So a flag honoring this country is the same as a random structure. Daniel asked. It asked about consistency. There it was again, procedural language hiding the real issue. A woman from the back row raised her hand hesitantly. I don't see how the flag hurts anyone. She said. It looks nice. Cynthia's expression tightened. Ma'am, we cannot govern based on personal opinions. We govern based on written policy. Another man spoke up. Isn't there federal protection for displaying the American flag? Cynthia's jaw flexed slightly. Homeowners associations retain authority over structural installations within private communities. It was a carefully worded response. Not entirely false. Not entirely transparent either. Daniel reached into a folder resting on his lap and pulled out a printed document. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. He said quietly. Signed into federal law. He placed it on the table in front of the board. It prohibits HOAs from restricting homeowners from displaying the U.S. flag on their property. Cynthia didn't touch the paper. That applies to reasonable restrictions, she said. And we are well within our rights to regulate permanent fixtures. So you're saying the issue isn't the flag? Daniel replied. It's the pole. Yes. And if I remove the pole and attach it to my house, that would still require review. A few neighbors exchanged looks. Daniel let the silence stretch. This feels less about structure, he said finally, and more about control. A faint gasp came from somewhere in the room. Cynthia's composure cracked just slightly. The fine stands at $200. If the violation is not corrected within 7 days, additional penalties will apply. Daniel met her gaze without blinking. What kind of penalties? A $500 secondary fine. Possible lien proceedings if noncompliance continues. There it was. The escalation. The room no longer felt neutral. It felt tense. Divided. Some neighbors shifted in support of Daniel. Others looked nervous. Perhaps worried about what challenging the board might mean for them. Cynthia leaned back in her chair. We encourage you to resolve this amicably. Mr. Harper. Amicably. By removing the flag. Daniel nodded slowly. Let me ask one more question. She gestured impatiently. If I take down the flag, he said, does that make the neighborhood more beautiful? No one answered. Cynthia closed her folder. This discussion is concluded. The gavel tapped lightly against the table. Meeting adjourned. As chairs scraped against the floor and neighbors filed out, a few approached Daniel quietly. I am sorry about this. It's not right. Wish I could say more. But no one spoke loudly. No one challenged the board openly. Cynthia gathered her papers, avoiding eye contact as she passed him. This is not personal, she said under her breath. Daniel looked up at her. It became personal when you said this isn't a military base. She didn't respond. Outside, the air felt cooler than before. The clubhouse lights glowed behind him as he wheeled toward his truck. His hands were steady on the controls, but his mind was sharper than ever. They thought he would fold under pressure. They thought fines and policy language would intimidate him. They thought escalating from $200 to $500 would make him quietly remove the pole and move on. They mistook calm for weakness. That night, another envelope was delivered to his mailbox. Second notice, $500 fine applied. Immediate removal required to avoid legal escalation. Daniel held the paper in his hands and read it twice. The numbers didn't scare him. The threat didn't shake him. What unsettled him was the principle. In a neighborhood wrapped in seasonal patriotism, a disabled veteran was being warned about liens for honoring the flag he once saluted under fire. He looked out his front window at the flagpole standing firm against the dark sky. The disrespect had crossed the line. And this time, he wasn't just disappointed. He was done being patient. What Cynthia and the rest of the board didn't understand was that Daniel Harper had spent most of his adult life reading fine print. Rules of engagement, operational briefings, military contracts, federal codes. When you serve long enough, you learn that the difference between power and protection is often buried in a single paragraph. So when the second fine arrived, $500, stamped in bold red ink, Daniel didn't react emotionally. He researched. That night, instead of watching the late news like he usually did, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open. The folded American flag rested beside him, placed there after sunset as it always was. He typed slowly but deliberately, searching through federal statutes and homeowner rights cases. It didn't take long to find it. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. He read every word. The law clearly stated that a condominium association, cooperative association, or residential real estate management association could not adopt or enforce any policy that would restrict or prevent a member from displaying the flag of the United States on residential property. There were allowances for reasonable restrictions related to time, place, and manner to protect safety and property values, but nothing that outright allowed an HOA to fine someone simply for flying a standard American flag on their own property. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. This wasn't as simple as Cynthia had made it sound. He dug deeper. Case law, legal commentary, veteran advocacy forums, stories of other homeowners who had faced similar pushback. In more than one situation, HOAs had attempted to interpret reasonable restrictions broadly, often too broadly. He printed everything. By midnight, a neat stack of documents sat on his table. Highlighted sections, margin notes written in steady handwriting. He wasn't preparing for a shouting match. He was preparing for strategy. The next morning at 7:12 a.m., he raised the flag again. Not defiantly, not angrily, just consistently. Across the street, Mr. Lawson, the older neighbor who had once given him a thumbs up, watched from his driveway. You planning to fight this? Lawson called out cautiously. Daniel secured the rope and turned slightly. I am planning to understand it. Lawson nodded slowly. HOA doesn't like to lose. Daniel gave a faint, knowing smile. Neither did the people I used to work with. Word spread quickly that Daniel hadn't removed the pole. The third notice didn't come immediately. Instead, something else arrived: a certified letter. Intent to pursue lien proceedings if noncompliance continued. The language was colder this time. More formal, less conversational. They were escalating. What they didn't know was that Daniel already had an appointment scheduled. 2 towns over, in a modest brick office building, sat attorney Rebecca Morales. She specialized in property rights and federal compliance disputes. Daniel found her after scanning through online reviews and legal directories late into the night. He arrived 10 minutes early. As usual, Rebecca greeted him with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. She didn't look surprised when he laid the stack of documents on her desk. HOA flag issue, she guessed. Daniel nodded. Let me see what they're reclaiming. She read through the violation notices carefully, lips pressing together as she reached the $500 fine and lien threat. They were leaning heavily on the structural installation angle, she said. They were not claiming you can fly the flag. They're reclaiming you didn't get approval for the pole. Daniel folded his hands calmly. Is that enough? Rebecca tapped the printed copy of the federal law he had brought. It depends on how reasonable restriction is interpreted, but threatening escalating fines for a 6-foot pole on private property. That's aggressive. Aggressive, Daniel repeated quietly. Rebecca looked up at him. You served 32 years. She glanced briefly at his prosthetic leg and back at his face. No pity, just recognition. They may not realize who they're pushing, she said. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. Rebecca continued reviewing the HOA bylaws Daniel had printed. Their guidelines are vague. They mention architectural harmony but don't define height limits for flagpoles specifically. So they're relying on interpretation. Daniel said, yes, an interpretation can be challenged. Silence settled for a moment. You don't strike me as someone who files lawsuits lightly, Rebecca added. I don't. Daniel replied. But I also don't ignore lines when they recrossed. Rebecca nodded once. If we proceed, it won't just be about your fines. We could challenge the policy itself. Daniel's eyes sharpened slightly. Meaning, if the court finds they're overstepping federal protections, the HOA could be forced to revise its guidelines. They could also be responsible for your legal fees. Daniel absorbed that information slowly. He hadn't come in thinking about changing policy. He had come in thinking about principle. But principle, he knew, often required precedent. Do it, he said calmly. Back in Maple Ridge Estates, Cynthia held an emergency board meeting. He asked consulting an attorney. One board member whispered nervously. On what grounds? Another asked. Cynthia maintained her composure, but there was tension behind her eyes. We are within our rights. The issue is structural compliance, but it's the American flag. Someone muttered. This is not about the flag. Cynthia insisted sharply. It asks about maintaining standards. Yet even she could feel it. The optics were dangerous. A disabled veteran. A patriotic symbol. An HOA enforcing fines. If it reached local media, it wouldn't look procedural. It would look heartless. Meanwhile, Daniel remained quiet. No social media posts. No dramatic neighborhood speeches. No yard signs. He simply continued raising the flag every morning. Consistency can be louder than outrage. Rebecca filed a formal demand letter, first an opportunity for the HOA to rescind the fines and revise their stance before federal litigation began. The letter cited the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act directly and warned of potential violations of federal protections. When Cynthia opened the envelope and read the legal language, something shifted. This was no longer an internal compliance matter. This was federal. The board scrambled to consult their own legal counsel. Emails flew back and forth. Emergency consultations were scheduled. They were overreacting, Cynthia said, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. Their attorney, however, was less confident. Courts do not look favorably on associations that appear to restrict federal protections, he warned, particularly involving veterans. This could escalate quickly. For the first time since the black SUV had pulled into Daniel's driveway, doubt crept into the room. They had assumed he would quietly remove the pole. They had assumed fines would intimidate him. They had assumed he didn't know the law. They had assumed wrong. One evening, as Daniel lowered the flag at sunset, a younger neighbor approached hesitantly. I heard you resuing the HOA, she said softly. Daniel folded the flag carefully before answering. I am asking them to respect federal law. She nodded slowly. For what it's worth. I hope you win. Daniel gave her a small, calm smile. It's not about winning, he said. It's about not letting something small become something bigger for the next person. Inside his house later that night, Rebecca called. They refused to rescind the fines. She said they were standing by their interpretation. Daniel looked toward the window where the flagpole stood silhouetted against the dark sky. Then we proceed, he replied. Paperwork was filed the next morning in federal court. Official, public, irreversible, in Maple Ridge Estates. Cynthia had no idea how quickly things were about to change. Because what the HOA didn't know wasn't just that Daniel was a veteran. It was that he had spent decades standing firm under pressure far greater than neighborhood fines. And once he decided to hold the line, the envelope arrived at the Maple Ridge HOA office on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with a federal court seal stamped across the front. It sat on Cynthia Blake's desk for nearly 20 minutes before she opened it, as if instinctively she knew that once she did, there would be no going back. Inside were official court documents notifying the association that Daniel Harper had filed a lawsuit in federal district court, alleging violations of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act and unlawful enforcement actions through excessive fines and lien threats. For a moment, the office felt smaller. Cynthia read the first page twice, then a third time. This is absurd, she muttered under her breath. But the confidence she usually carried was thinner now. An emergency board meeting was called that same afternoon. All 5 members showed up, faces tight with concern. Their retained attorney joined via video conference, his tone far less dismissive than before. This is no longer a neighborhood dispute, he said bluntly. This is federal litigation, and the optics are challenging. Optics, Cynthia repeated. You fined a disabled veteran for flying the American flag, the attorney said carefully. That's how this will be framed. Silence fell across the table. Outside the HOA office, word spread faster than anyone expected. By evening, several neighbors had already heard that federal court papers had been filed. Screenshots of the public case docket began circulating in a community Facebook group. Comments multiplied by the hour. Is this real? They're resuing Daniel. Why didn't the board just drop it? This looks bad. By the next morning, a local news reporter had submitted an inquiry email requesting comment from the association. That's when panic truly set in. Meanwhile, Daniel remained exactly as he had been since the beginning, calm, consistent, deliberate. At 7:12 a.m., he raised the flag. At sunset, he lowered it. No press conferences, no dramatic statements, no interviews. When a reporter knocked on his door, he simply said, I believe in following the law, and closed it gently. The first hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. In that time, the neighborhood atmosphere changed. Conversations hushed when board members walked by. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with Daniel now gave subtle nods of respect. A few even stopped to shake his hand. Cynthia, however, doubled down publicly. In a formal email blast to residents, she wrote, The Maple Ridge HOA is committed to maintaining community standards and enforcing guidelines fairly and consistently. The pending legal matter involves structural compliance and will be addressed appropriately through legal channels. It sounded official. It sounded controlled. It didn't calm anyone. The day of the hearing arrived with gray skies and steady drizzle. The federal courthouse downtown stood tall and imposing, its marble columns reflecting the muted light. Daniel arrived early with Rebecca Morales at his side. He wore a simple navy suit, the American flag pin on his lapel small but unmistakable. Cynthia entered the building 15 minutes later with 2 other board members and the HOA's attorney. She avoided looking in Daniel's direction. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavy but precise. Federal court operated differently than HOA meetings. There was no casual tone, no conversational enforcement of community standards. There were statutes, arguments, and consequences. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The case was called. Rebecca presented first. Her voice was steady, measured. Your Honor, this case concerns a homeowner's federally protected right to display the flag of the United States on his residential property. The defendant association imposed escalating fines and threatened lien proceedings over a 6-foot flagpole, citing vague architectural guidelines that do not explicitly prohibit such installations. She paused briefly before continuing. Mr. Harper is a disabled veteran who served this country for over 3 decades. The association's enforcement actions were not reasonable restrictions. They were punitive. The word echoed quietly. Punitive. The HOA's attorney stood next. Your Honor, the association does not dispute Mr. Harper's right to display the American flag. The issue is structural compliance. Permanent installations require prior review to maintain property values and uniform standards. The judge leaned forward slightly. Counsel, he said, is there an explicit prohibition in the association's guidelines regarding flagpoles of this size? The attorney hesitated. Not explicitly, Your Honor. However, the guidelines require approval for. I've reviewed the bylaws. The judge interrupted calmly. They are vague. The courtroom grew quieter. Rebecca stepped forward again. Furthermore, Your Honor, the association escalated fines from $200 to $500 within days and initiated lien threats despite Mr. Harper's documented compliance with federal flag display standards. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act was enacted precisely to prevent this type of overreach. The judge turned his gaze toward the HOA board members seated behind their attorney. Why, he asked, was removal demanded rather than review conducted after installation? Cynthia shifted in her seat. The attorney answered for her. The board believed prior approval was mandatory, and when the homeowner cited federal protections, the attorney paused. They maintained their position. The judge's expression hardened slightly. Federal protections are not optional, he said evenly. Associations may impose reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, but they may not effectively prevent the display of the flag through punitive measures. Daniel remained still, hands folded calmly in his lap. The judge continued. The escalation of fines and initiation of lien proceedings appears disproportionate given the nature of the alleged violation. Disproportionate. The word hung in the air like a verdict before the verdict. The hearing lasted less than 2 hours, but by the end of it, the energy in the room had shifted unmistakably. This was no longer about landscaping aesthetics. It was about authority exceeding its bounds. A week later, the written ruling was issued. The court found that the HOA's enforcement actions were unreasonable under the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. The fines were ordered dismissed. Lien proceedings were prohibited. The association was directed to revise its guidelines to ensure compliance with federal law. Additionally, the HOA was required to cover Daniel's legal fees. When the news broke, it moved quickly beyond Maple Ridge Estates. Local headlines framed it clearly. Disabled veteran wins federal case against HOA over American flag display. Interviews aired. Legal analysts commented. Veteran advocacy groups shared the story online. Back in the neighborhood, the impact was immediate. Emergency board meetings resumed, but this time, the tone was defensive rather than authoritative. Residents began questioning other enforcement practices. Old complaints resurfaced. Transparency demands increased. Cynthia's once steady confidence fractured under pressure. At a special community session, several homeowners openly criticized the board's handling of the situation. You should have dropped it. You embarrassed the neighborhood. This never should have gone to court. For the first time, Cynthia had no prepared language strong enough to steady the room. Meanwhile, Daniel did exactly what he had always done. At 7:12 a.m., he raised the flag. But this time, something was different. As the fabric caught the morning wind, a few neighbors stood outside their homes watching. Not out of curiosity, out of respect. No speeches were made. No victory banners were hung. But the power dynamic had shifted permanently. The HOA had attempted to enforce control through fines and procedural language. Instead, they had triggered federal oversight, public scrutiny, and a legal ruling that reshaped their authority. They thought they were defending aesthetic standards. They had underestimated principle. And in trying to silence one flag, they had amplified its meaning far beyond the boundaries of Maple Ridge Estates. The official court order arrived on a clear Friday morning. printed on thick paper with language that left no room for interpretation. All fines imposed against Daniel Harper were dismissed. The threat and lien was void. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association was required to revise its governing documents to comply with federal law. And perhaps most painfully for the board, the association was ordered to pay Daniel's legal fees in full. It wasn't just a loss. It was a correction. By noon, every homeowner in Maple Ridge Estates had received an email copy of the ruling. The tone was noticeably different from previous HOA messages. There was no mention of aesthetic standards or structural compliance. Instead, the message read, "The board acknowledges the court's findings and will take immediate steps to update our policies to ensure alignment with federal regulations." Acknowledges, not defends, not explains. Acknowledges. Cynthia Blake sat in her kitchen staring at the screen long after pressing send. For weeks, she had convinced herself this was about consistency, about upholding standards, about preventing disorder. But the court had reframed it in a way she hadn't anticipated. Disproportionate, overreach, federal protection. Those words carried weight. Across the neighborhood, reactions varied. Some residents felt vindicated. They had quietly believed Daniel was right but hadn't wanted to challenge the board openly. Others felt embarrassed that it had escalated so far. A few remained loyal to the HOA, insisting rules existed for a reason, but no one could deny the outcome. The following Tuesday, a special community meeting was held to address the ruling and outline policy revisions. The clubhouse was fuller than it had been in years. Nearly every chair was occupied. Daniel sat in the same aisle seat he had chosen weeks earlier. Calm, composed, no sign of triumph on his face. Cynthia stood at the front again, but her posture was different, less rigid, less certain. "The court has directed us to amend our architectural guidelines," she began, specifically regarding the display of the United States flag. A murmur of approval moved through the room. "We will be drafting a clear provision stating that homeowners may install and maintain flagpoles of reasonable height for the purpose of displaying the American flag without prior approval, provided safety standards are met." Clear provision. No ambiguity this time. A hand rose in the back. "Why wasn't that in place before?" someone asked. Cynthia hesitated. "Our guidelines were written broadly. We believed they allowed for discretionary review. That discretion cost the community legal fees." Another voice added. The tension wasn't explosive, but it was undeniable. One of the other board members leaned toward the microphone. "We also want to apologize to Mr. Harper for how this matter was handled." The room fell quiet. All eyes turned toward Daniel. Cynthia swallowed before speaking again. "Mr. Harper, on behalf of the association, I apologize for the escalation of enforcement actions and any distress caused. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. But it was public." Daniel nodded once. "Thank you," he said simply. He didn't lecture. He didn't gloat. He didn't remind them of the headlines or the ruling language. He accepted it. Over the next month, policy changes were formally adopted. The new guidelines were specific, carefully worded to prevent future interpretation disputes. Homeowners could now install flagpoles up to 8 feet tall without prior review, provided they met basic safety requirements. It seemed like a small adjustment, but in Maple Ridge Estates, it symbolized something larger. Authority had limits, and those limits mattered. Pressure continued building around the board's leadership. At the annual election meeting, multiple residents nominated new candidates for board positions. Transparency and accountability became campaign themes within what had once been a quiet suburban association. Cynthia chose not to run again. Her resignation letter was brief, citing a desire to focus on personal matters, whether it was voluntary or quietly encouraged. No one said aloud. The new board president, a retired school principal named Margaret Lawson, wife of the neighbor who had once given Daniel a thumbs up, took office with a noticeably different tone. "We're here to serve the community," she said at her first meeting, "not control it." Meanwhile, Daniel's life returned to its steady rhythm. He hadn't sought media attention, but veteran groups had reached out privately to thank him. A few neighboring communities invited him to speak about property rights and federal protections. He declined most invitations politely. He hadn't fought to become a symbol. He had fought to draw a line. On a quiet Saturday morning, several weeks after the ruling, something unexpected happened. At 7:10 a.m., Daniel rolled down his ramp as usual. But this time, he wasn't alone. Across the street, Mr. Lawson stood by a newly installed flagpole in his own yard. 2 houses down, a younger family was attaching a bracket-mounted flag to their porch. Even the corner house, previously silent throughout the dispute, had placed a small flag near their mailbox. No coordination, no announcements, just quiet solidarity. Daniel clipped his flag into place and began raising it. As the fabric climbed the pole and caught the morning breeze, he noticed something else. People were watching, but not from behind blinds. They were standing outside, hands over hearts, coffee mugs paused midair, children looking up curiously. When the flag reached the top, a few neighbors clapped softly. Not loudly, not theatrically, just enough. Daniel lowered his hand from the rope and looked down the street. The view felt different now, not because the houses had changed, but because the atmosphere had. Respect had replaced tension. Where there had been silence, there was acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, a handwritten envelope appeared in his mailbox. Inside was a simple note signed by 12 households. Thank you for standing firm. You reminded us what those colors mean. He read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it in a drawer beside his service medals. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky shifted into deep orange, Daniel rolled back outside to lower the flag. The neighborhood was calm, peaceful in the way he had hoped it would be when he first bought the house. He lowered the fabric slowly, deliberately, the way he always had. Some victories are loud, others are quiet. This one didn't involve fireworks or dramatic speeches. It involved boundaries, clarity, courage. The HOA had tried to enforce control through escalating fines and procedural authority. Instead, they had rewritten their own rules. They had strengthened federal compliance. They had reshaped leadership. And they had reminded an entire community that respect isn't decorative, it's foundational. As Daniel folded the flag neatly in his hands, he glanced once more at the pole standing firm in his yard. They had tried to make it about aesthetics. He had made it about principle. And in doing so, he didn't just win a case. He changed the rules for everyone who would ever live on that street again. If you love real HOA drama and justice served, hit subscribe and don't miss the next story. Fire never stepped back.